Hello and welcome to Invisible Hate. I'm Asad Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.
On January 28th, 2021, 84-year-old Vicha Ratanapakdee is getting ready to go out for a walk. It's during COVID, so he puts on not only a baseball cap, but also a COVID mask for his morning walk in the Anza Vista neighborhood of San Francisco. He's a small, frail, and nearly blind immigrant from Thailand. At around 8:30 a.m., as he is walking, Vicha appears to notice something and changes course, turning right where he would normally go straight. At that moment, Antoine Watson, a 19-year-old African-American man, runs across the street towards Vicha at full speed. Watson plows into the old man, pushing him down with incredible force. Vicha's hat flies off as his head hits the ground. His body slides across the pavement. Watson appears to celebrate, then goes to his car parked nearby and grabs his cell phone. He returns and takes pictures as his victim lies there, still and bleeding. Watson then goes back to his car, where his 20-year-old girlfriend is waiting, and disappears. Witnesses call for help, and Vicha is brought to the hospital, where they attempt to treat him for a brain hemorrhage. He never regains consciousness and dies in his sleep at the hospital 2 days later. This is Invisible Hate. Welcome back to Invisible Hate, a weekly true crime podcast in which Saadia and I attempt to uncover the ugly truth behind various hate crimes, both recent and historical.
Yes, that's right, Asad. Many of the cases that we discuss involve crimes committed against minority groups. Our goal is to determine through a discussion of the nuances and complexities of these unfortunate situations whether or not these transgressions can be considered hate crimes. As will soon become very clear, today's case appears to fit many of the criteria for a hate crime. But as we always say, let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's just start with simple details of the case. So, Asad, can you take us to the day of the crime?
Yeah, let's start with the victim first. Vicha Ratanapakdee grew up on a farm in southern Thailand, one of 8 children. He works as an auditor there for a prominent financial institution. Vicha first arrives in the US in the year 2000 to spend the year with his daughter while she attends business school. After coming back for a while to Thailand, he returns to the US with his wife in 2018 to help take care of their 2 grandsons. They move in with their daughter and son-in-law in Anza Vista, which is just outside of San Francisco. He is a passive and gentle Buddhist, a loving husband, father, and grandfather. He is also quite slight, Saadia, standing at 5'6" and just 113 pounds. Also, just to note, 9 months prior to the crime, Vicha had heart surgery, but the doctor tells him to keep active after the surgery, and that's actually something that Vicha is happy to do, especially when the pandemic began. He becomes known in the community for his hour-long walks, which are normally safe.
Wow, Asad. Now imagine this 84-year-old man who had heart surgery. He's active, he goes out. I'm sure he's worried about COVID, right? But he's wearing his mask, he's taking all the precautions. And then this tragic incident happens to him. Can you tell us a little bit about the perpetrator, Antoine Watson?
Yeah, so the night before the attack, Antoine Watson has had a very atypical night and morning. The evening before, he and his girlfriend leave his parents' home in Daly City near South San Francisco after a family dispute. At about 2 a.m., he is pulled over by police for running a stop sign, speeding, and reckless driving, which results in a minor collision. Evidently, the officers point their guns at him and handcuff him during this arrest. As a young black man, obviously, this is understandably terrifying as any man, but specifically as a black man, we all know what could happen. I read that there's actually footage, perhaps from a body camera, of Watson repeatedly banging on a car and yelling clearly he's in distress. The police detain him and then issue a citation, and he ends up sleeping in his car that night. It's the next morning that Watson sees Vicha out on his morning walk, his typical morning walk. In clear and disturbing footage that is captured on a neighbor's security camera, we see Vicha's out for a walk and then looks at something across the street and then makes a turn. He definitely sees that Watson is approaching. Watson is overheard saying something like, "Why are you looking at me?" as he kind of charges over towards Vicha. And not slowing down at all, he runs directly into Vicha, sending him flying onto the driveway. Really, just like all I can picture, Saadia, is like something from the NFL. You know, they have all those pads and they're built for this. But then you think about it, it's an 84-year-old man that this happened, right? Without any padding, without any, so violent.
It is definitely so violent, Asad. I can't even imagine what this 84-year-old man must be thinking at that time.
Yeah, and then get this, Watson immediately turns around and heads back in the direction he came from, pumping his fists as if he's victorious, like he's done something that he should be proud of, and, the crowd is cheering, like, that's what he's doing. And then, Saadia, we alluded to this in the opening, there's actually additional footage that's not publicly available that shows Watson apparently returning to take photos of Vicha on his phone.
I said, you know what? The details about him, that is Watson, celebrating and then going back to take pictures are really so sick. But at the same time, I keep thinking, now this kid was in distress, right? So he was detained. And I wonder if Vicha looking at him and changing course triggered something in him. I was thinking about this, like maybe he thought that Vicha saw him as a threat and that made him angrier. Who knows, right? Who knows what he was thinking at the time?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's truly shocking. The other thing, Saadia, is, nothing is stolen from the victim. And so, yeah, it really was just kind of this random act of violence, right? And Watson then returns to his BMW parked across the street and flees with his girlfriend. Meanwhile, witnesses see Vicha and try to help. He's still alive and struggling to get up. And luckily, he's taken to a nearby hospital pretty quickly. But with no ID on him, police have trouble identifying who he is. His daughter begins to worry when her father still hasn't returned home. She notices that his tablet is gone, and so she calls it, only to have the police answer and tell her that he has been seriously assaulted. Vicha's family arrives at the hospital to find him gravely injured, unconscious, and bleeding in his brain. They are told that even if he wakes, he's virtually brain dead. 2 days later, Saadia, he dies because of his injuries.
I said, I can't even bring myself to comment on this, right? I'm trying to process all this information, and it's just so sad and tragic that two families are destroyed in this moment. Obviously, Vicha's family, because he's dead, right? The time that his daughter, his grandsons could have spent with him is lost. And on the other hand, this 19-year-old kid has done something so horrific, and this will stay with him for the rest of his life. Now, whether he remorses now or 10 years from now or 20 years from now, it's going to stay with him forever.
Yeah, for sure. It's outrageously sad. And also just, we talk so much about the randomness of some of the crimes that, all of us go out for a walk every day, right? Like, this is just a natural thing that we're doing. A lot of us do it for the rest of our lives. We do it a lot of times solo. And to think that something like this could happen, it's so shocking and scary for sure.
Yeah. So We are going to take a short break, but when we come back, we will talk more about the investigation. Welcome back to Invisible Hit. So, Asad, can you tell me about the investigation?
Yeah, so Saadia, it doesn't take long, obviously, for police to discover the footage of the crime and begin to search for the perpetrator. As we've talked about before, there's so many cameras nowadays that are out and about, so it's just a matter of going to different, houses to seeing what's up and what's visible. Evidently, the body cam footage from the earlier encounter with police also helps officers identify Watson as well as his girlfriend, whose name is Malaysia Gu. Watson and Gu are arrested a couple days later at Watson's family home in Daly City, where they both are living. Watson is initially charged with assault with a deadly weapon and elder abuse, which I guess I didn't really realize that elder abuse was an actual crime. They had a murder charge added once Vicha dies, and Gu, the girlfriend, is charged as an accessory after the fact for fleeing with Watson.
Asad, I'm confused. Like, assault with a deadly weapon? Like, just to clarify, was a weapon involved?
Yeah, no weapons, but I guess in this case, Watson's body is considered the deadly weapon. And
is that even a legal term?
Yeah, sadly, I don't know. If they can charge this and they think that it is, it makes sense to me. His body, he's probably 180 to 200 pounds, I'm just guessing, and running at that speed, that is, a deadly weapon. And Saadia, video of this incident actually goes viral. ABC News first airs the video of the attack, which many people have watched since. Vicha's daughter and son-in-law also see the footage for the first time on ABC alongside with everyone else. Not knowing many details of what occurred, they are horrified to see how the attack actually plays out. Vicha's daughter and wife immediately head to the site of the crime to clean the blood off the sidewalk, because there was still blood there, in an effort to allow his soul to leave the earth and begin the afterlife.
Oh my God, Asad, this is so sad. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on this. First, releasing or airing a disturbing video of the attack is not something that I think should have happened. And I know there are different schools of thought on it, but for me, it just amounts to trauma porn, right? Watching something so horrific, and especially for the family, because if you know there is a footage out there, then you'll go and you'll watch it. And once you watch it, it will traumatize you for the rest of your lives, because it's not some stranger, it's your own family member, right? So that's one that kind of bothers me. I don't know how others feel about it. And then second, they going there to clean the blood. I'm sure there is some religious significance to it, right?
So to your first point, that trauma porn, I think that we're all guilty of it depending on the situation. And, for me in this case, it seems like the police or someone should have warned the family that this video existed and given them a chance to watch it, before it publicly aired. I do think that, things like this are in the interest of the public, but yeah, I mean, nowadays, news, it's like any other form of entertainment or journalism. You got to get the clicks and you got to get the views in order to make the money. And, this is a pretty salacious piece of video that will get people to watch, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, and I wonder if this particular video gets this particular crime a lot of press, or is it just, one elderly minority dying and nobody really cares?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. Sadly, I worked in broadcast journalism for a little while, a station in Boston that actually was the one that popularized this approach to broadcast news, which is called "If it bleeds, it leads." Basically, I want to say in the 90s or early 2000s, a lot of the local coverage ended up being this crime stories first, because people were more apt to tune in to these kind of things. Like otherwise, people don't really care generally about like what's happening at the State House, but they will tune in if they see a car crash or a murder investigation or things like that. And so, yeah, the station that I worked at, which is a very big station in the Boston area, was the one that popularized this approach, and then it got mimicked across the country, which is interesting to me.
Oh, wow.
So Saadia, to that point, this crime gets widespread, not only local, but national, even international coverage, thanks to both the footage and to the Bay Area community. And before we get into it, I just want to talk a little bit about the political climate. Remember, it's early 2021, so right at the end of President Trump's presidency. And it's about 8 months after George Floyd's death. And people start comparing the injustice of these two cases. And also, you'll remember that there's been a clear pattern of targeted hate against Asian Americans nationwide for not entirely clear reasons. We've talked about, one incident, the Atlanta spa shootings that occurred 2 months after this. And we have, a podcast on that if you want to listen to it. But obviously, Saadia, I think if people remember, much of the rise in hate can be attributed to Trump and his blaming of China for COVID during this time. Take a listen to this clip from CNN.
The then president's words,
China virus, Kung flu,
have lasting impacts, says Professor Russell Chung, who tracked those 2,800 hate incidents through Stop AAPI Hate, because no governmental agency would.
Mainstream society doesn't believe that we face racism, and we needed to document what was happening.
Saadia, there aren't a lot of post-COVID crime studies, but one study from Pew from June 2020 finds that a third of Asian Americans reported being the target of racist slurs or jokes since the start of the pandemic, and 26% feared a physical assault. California has the highest Asian American and Pacific Islander population in the United States at 17% in 2021. I guess I didn't realize this, but California is a majority minority state. I don't know if you knew that,
wow,
Saadia.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. The white community makes up about 35 or 40% of the population. The rest is mixes of other cultures, but I thought that was interesting. Anyway, so back in the Bay Area, they've experienced this wave of kind of Asian American violence. The Alameda County District Attorney says, and I quote, "The rapid increase in criminal acts targeted against members of the Asian community, particularly Chinese Americans who live and work in the county, is intolerable," end quote. Oddly, there are a lot of these kind of shoving attacks on elderly Asian people, similar to what happened to Vicha, which is just so baffling to me. It gets so bad that volunteers there start offering escorts for elderly Asian residents, as well as help communicating with law enforcement. But sadly, the abuse isn't just against the elderly. Vicha's daughter in 2020 is twice told to leave the country and is spat at and swung at. 1 month after Vicha's death, the state of California actually funded $1.4 million project to track and research racist incidents against Asian Americans. The vast majority of hate crimes are in fact committed by white perpetrators, but there is some data showing that hate crimes against Asian Americans specifically are more likely to be committed by non-white offenders. The attention this case receives also, unfortunately, spurs anti-Black racism and the profiling of Black men in the Bay Area, because remember that Watson is Black. Similarly, an anti-Asian hate crime task force formed in New York City instills panic in the Black community there. So what do you think about that, Saadia? If highlighting hate crimes also perpetuates prejudice, what's the answer?
Asad, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a complicated situation. On the one hand, we saw a lot of uptick in anti-Asian racism, crimes against the Asian community, but at the same time, the perpetrator in this case is a Black person, and the fear of profiling and targeting of Black people is real. So I honestly don't know what the answer is. And to be honest, you know this, there are times when I'm almost scared and reluctant to cover hate crime cases in which the perpetrator and the victim are both from non-white communities for this exact reason, because I fear that we may be perpetuating hate or perpetuating stereotypes against already racialized, targeted minorities. But at the same time, this happens, right? And then the question becomes, if this perpetrator were white, it would be one perpetrator and one crime. But now, in this case, since the perpetrator was black, the target becomes the entire community.
Yeah, right, for sure.
And that's where I'm always, hesitant to give my opinion or see how these prejudices play out.
Yeah, totally get that.
But the community did come together.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, they did. The Bay Area Asian American community and their allies came together. It started with the district attorney, a person that you might know of by the name of Chesa Boudin. He acknowledges the audacity of Vicha's death, but does not pursue hate crime charges, though he calls the crime senseless and horrific. He also uses a poor choice of words to describe Watson's behavior that morning and the evening before as some sort of temper tantrum. And so there's a huge backlash in the area. Vicha's family, who had voted for Boudin, feel like he's minimizing the crime and that his campaign promises were empty. When Vicha's son-in-law directly asks Boudin if this can be characterized as a hate crime, Boudin says he can't talk about it. Boudin says, and I quote, "Although our system is pretty effective at processing cases and punishing, we're not effective at providing the kinds of answers the families in pain need to feel a sense of closure or to be able to move on with their lives after suffering and often unthinkable harm." Yeah, I think that's exactly right, for sure. Because of the DA, widespread supporters of Vicha plan rallies outside San Francisco's Hall of Justice on every day that Watson is scheduled to have a hearing. They increase the pressure on authorities to designate the motive as hate. The crime is highly publicized, and Vicha becomes known as Grandpa Vicha around town. There are a lot of other things that they do for Grandpa Vicha, including renaming a street in his honor and painting a large mural of him near Chinatown. And there's actually a still active GoFundMe campaign and a Justice for Vicha Foundation that has formed. His death also helps to spark the national Stop Asian Hate movement.
Wow, Asad, this is a lot of information and I can't wait to know what happens in court. But before we do that, let's take a short break. Welcome back to Invisible Hate. So Asad, tell me, what happens next?
Yeah, so as we said, Watson and his girlfriend were arrested. And for a little bit of background, Watson is born and raised in San Francisco, near where the incident actually occurred. He's part of a family of 12 who are struggling badly during the pandemic. Watson loses his job and also his support system as his mother leaves temporarily for better paying work elsewhere. He has previously gone to therapy and taken medication, but he has no prior criminal convictions. His family has been very supportive throughout all of this. And at the bail hearing, his attorney asks for a neuropsychological evaluation and home confinement for therapy, which is not granted. The attorney says that this was and I quote, an impulsive, unmotivated assault and not an intended murder. As evidence, he notes that Watson used an open-handed push as opposed to, I guess, like a punch or use of an actual weapon. He reminds the court that Watson is a teenager and says that he just experienced a breakdown, the night before. The DA soon drops the accessory charges against his girlfriend and releases her. No evidence is found that she aided in the crime, and the BMW she's waiting in is parked so that she is seated facing in the opposite direction when the attack occurs. As far as I know, Watson is the driver, not his girlfriend. Watson is then assigned a public defender who feels that the blame is misplaced because of the national political climate. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for June of 2022, where Watson pleads not guilty. Here is a clip from ABC News.
A 21-year-old Daly City man was in court today, charged with killing an elderly immigrant from Thailand with one brutal shove to the ground that you probably saw on videotape. It's a story that made national news when it first happened.
As they crowded into court for the preliminary hearing, the family had seen that video many times. Still, there were audible gasps and tears when the prosecutor played it as evidence. And as the first witnesses to arrive at the crime scene described Vicha still alive, struggling to get up.
One of the main purposes of the preliminary hearing is to determine whether the crime meets the standard of, quote, implied malice required for a murder charge. The judge decided that it does, which means that if he is convicted, Watson would face 25 years to life. The DA at this point has already stated that there won't be a hate crime charge, which would not extend a sentence significantly in California, just about 3 years, but would, of course, send a very important message. And despite all the protests from the family and supporters, the hate crime charges never materialize. As for motive, Watson's attorney claims mental stress and trauma from Watson's prior encounter with the police. She also says that Watson wasn't able to identify Vicha's race or age because of the hat and mask he had on. Remember, it was COVID. His attorney acknowledges his outburst of rage, but says he did not intend to kill Vicha.
Asad, what happens at the trial then?
Yeah, so sadly, Saadia, here we are like 3 years after the crime and the trial is still pending. There's been a huge backlog of trials because of the pandemic, and also both sides have delayed asking for more time for the investigation while also blaming opposing counsel for the holdup. The DA's office says that the ball is in the defense's court. Vicha's daughter thinks the defense is being strategic, hoping witnesses' memories will fade if they prolong this, longer and longer. The defense expects to file a motion to dismiss all the charges, which will presumably be rejected. There was a plan to reconvene in February of 2024, just a couple months ago, to set a trial date, but that has come and gone. Meanwhile, Watson has remained in custody this whole time.
This is pretty messed up, Asad. I don't know what to say here because it's been 3 years. I agree with Vicha's daughter that witnesses may just forget the actual facts about the crime, and that is so crucial to the trial, right? I get the backlog thing, but then think about the victims and their families and even perpetrator, right? A trial is being dragged on and we don't know how long this will go and when the trial will even start. So Asad, I think this is a good place to deliberate on whether or not this was or this is a hate crime. What do you think?
Yeah, so Saadia, I think this is a tough one for me. I think that my gut tells me that it was motivated by hate. I think the fact that Vicha was wearing a hat and mask, maybe that covered up his identity. I don't know. I think it's really tough. What do you think?
I think it's tough too, Asad, because as you said, Vicha was wearing a mask. He had a hat, so that probably covered his identity. And something that I said in the beginning is what I'm going to go back to. Watson saying, "Why are you looking at me?" That could have been a trigger because he was already detained. He probably was distressed. He was angry for being who he was, right? He probably thought that he was being racially profiled by Vicha, but at the end of the day, it was a horrific outburst of rage, and there needs to be some consequences. Whether it's a hate crime or not, maybe not, but a murder, yes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the more likely scenario is that he was targeting someone who was frail, that he knew that he could very easily knock over, assault, all those kind of things, and get away with, right? And so he saw Vicha on the street and an old man walking, presumably slower than a younger person would, and so for me, it's more of an age-related crime, perhaps, than a race-related one. To your point as well, I think it's still serious, and I think he should be held accountable for sure. I think going back to your other point, I don't understand why the trial is still going on. There's so much evidence, video evidence of him committing the attack, right? And so I don't understand that, right? But for me, like, he should be in jail and should be held accountable for what he has done.
Yeah, and I said, we've talked about this so many times on our podcast, right? Yes, people do horrific things when they are angry and they're outraged. Something triggers this violent behavior in them. So what does rehabilitation look like, right? Yeah. Putting them in jail, yes, that is the solution that a lot of times suffices for a lot of people. But I think it worsens situations, not just for the perpetrator, but how communities are perceived and how, crimes and violence occurs in this society. There is so much anger towards each other. And I wish and I hope there is something more than just putting people in jails after the fact.
Agreed. I'm hoping that he gets some support. I mean, he was only 19 when this happened. That's so young, and his brain is still developing. And he's still, I'm sure that if he hasn't already, at some point soon, he's going to realize, just what he did and how horrific it was. And I'm hoping that this won't define him in the rest of his life, and that he's able to learn from this and be a productive member of society, as we've seen with so many other people, in the cases that we've talked about. But yeah, 2 lives ruined, more than 2 lives ruined, but 2 directly because of this.
Absolutely, Asad. This was a sad story, and especially when we see an uptick in hate crimes, it's just so sad. But anyways, we would love to hear what our listeners think, and if they have any thoughts on this or any other case. Thanks again for listening to Invisible Hate. If you want to learn more, check out links in the show notes about the case. Please do email us your thoughts on this story or any other story you think we should cover. You can reach us at info@invisiblehatepodcast.com, or you can tweet us or hit us up on Instagram. Just search for Invisible Hate Podcast.
Thanks again for listening. If you like what you hear, please share with a friend. Invisible Hate is a joint production of Rafaelion Media and Immigrantly. We'd like to thank our team, which includes Michaela Strather, Lindsay Gamble, and Emmanuel Monahan. Our theme music was done by Simon Hutchinson. Our sound design was done by Paroma Chakravarti. We'll be back next week with another hate crime for us to analyze. Until then, I'm Asad Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.
Take care.